Rosanna Baker has had to step down as a librarian since she's with Jean now and basically taking care of Jean. So if anyone would like to take over the librarian job, you're welcome. I'll do it however long as I am able to. The next month will be her reviews that the books she's read. This one is from True West magazine. It's by Brett Cogburn, The Real Rooster Cogburn. Brett Cogburn tells the story of his great-grandfather's role in the creation of a classic Western fiction and film character, John Wayne in True Grit. There really was a raw rooster Cogburn named Rooster by his uncle, although his original name was John Franklin Cogburn. This fascinating history of Rooster may entice you to watch True Grit or embellish it again if you have already seen the movie. This was in the True West magazine, April 2022. Okay, the second one she read is by Douglas Christian, Fort Bowie, Arizona, Combat Post of the Southwest, 1858 to 1891. This is a true history book for the serious historian that relates in detail how Fort Bowie came to be from the beginning, progressing through the Civil War and the factions that were vying for Apache Pass because of the spring in that location. The story includes 4 decades of events that surrounded the fort, including extensive references, a list of commanding officers, stations, units, and notes. The third one is by Ben T. Trayrick, who lives here in Tombstone. It's called Camellia's Fly, the man who photographed history. Tombstone, Red Marie's bookstore, even though he sold it at this point. This is the story of C.S. Fly, the photographer of Tombstone during the mining years. His personal history is not extensive, but the facts are written down from newspaper articles and odd letters. Many pictures are included by C.S. Fly in the book. I think you will enjoy books written by Ben Trayrick, out of our past Tombstone historian. He has written 35 books and published up 1,300 articles. And if anyone would like to check out any material, back in the back, there's a sign-up sheet. Just please return it when you can. If anyone has any overdue materials, please return them when you can. Thank you.
Okay, Karen, said you got some cowboy poetry.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming. I was given a really nice book. It's called Southwestern Cowboy Poetry, and this was written by Bill Bean. This is a real cute one. It's called The Coyote Caper. I spotted him laying neath a mesquite tree, spread tight against the ground. His eyes were staring brightly at the supper he had found. He eased ahead an inch or two, then pressed again down tight. He quivered just thinking of the rabbit in his sight. The rabbit had no idea the coyote was even near, so he sat there in the grass, a scratching on his ear. The coyote tensed up his muscles, then squalled an awful yelp and reared straight over backwards, a biting at himself. The rabbit quickly cut and run down through the brushy draw. The coyote was doing flip-flops of him, and he no more saw. I eased where the coyote had laid, pondering why he lost his head. Old Coyote had no idea he was laying in a red ant bed.
My voice doesn't give out. This one is called God and Mr. Peabody by Bud Strong. When the dust had cleared on Allen Street and the horses settled down, the Benson stage ground to a halt. On the tombstone side of town, 4 men stepped out onto the ground, spitting dust and dirt and gravel, destined for much greater things, made the hardship worth the travel. One a peddler, one a soldier, and one a millionaire. Each traveler to this arid land with a dream of riches there. The last one off, a tall, slim man, Peabody was his name. His manner spoke of things to come, to the town of bloody fame. He came to serve a 6-month tour to help them settle down. The Church of England was his faith, sent this preacher to our town. The year was 1882. Town tensions reached their height with miners, gamblers, outlaw men, and ladies of the night. Embrace this preacher, man of cloth? This man the word to spread? The resistance was strong and the law was the bullet lead. The reverend would not be swayed. His congregation grew. They needed now a place to pray. Of course, he was not through. He visited the gambling hall and the bars where money lay, hovered over games of chance. Patrons parted with their pay. Contributions for a building fund came in from all around. He worked on miners, shopkeepers too. It spread throughout this town. He became a respected figure, a sportsman of great skill, could hold his own in boxing. In most sports had his will. He organized a baseball team, the first that Tombstone saw. It became a favorite sport in town, but the preacher was the draw. Before each game, he made a rule: the players must obey. Attend the church before the game to be eligible to play. His congregation multiplied, and soon the coffers filled. At last, they had sufficient funds for them to church to build. A record set as in that time, resistance was not small. For in 6 months, the building grew. The church was named St. Paul. It now and then stands stately tall, historic sight profound. God is proud, and so are we, that Mr. Peabody came to town.
Short story. Yeah, and I understand Bob's got a 1-minute history for us.
Well, it's a short story. So what other event that's coming up in Tombstone? Some of you guys might know that I eat mostly a vegetarian diet. I'm starting a Whole Foods plant-based eating club in Friday the 13th at 1:30 at the senior center. I lost 80 pounds, kept it off for 8 years, got off 2 medications. So Jonathan, you need to be there. So this story is rumored to be true. I mean, that Wyatt told this around the campfire on his vendetta rack. This story starts out with the 4 Galliano brothers, part of the wealthy Galliano family from Italy, and they came to America to make their mark. And if you remember back then, Ruby was just getting started. People were finding gold and silver nuggets as big as your thumb and getting rich, rich, rich. And the trail from Santa Fe ran right to where Fairbanks would be one day, but then veered south 5 miles to avoid an Indian burial ground on the other side of the San Pedro. Bad, bad medicine over there. So it's about this time the Galliano brothers had come to Santa Fe, and they ran the livery stable and the hardware store, but they wanted adventure. They wanted to sell everything they had, lock, stock, and barrel, and go to Ruby and strike it rich, rich, rich. Now the brothers were smart. They were planning for months. They got the best deals on their businesses, and best of all, got lucky enough to get the best guide in the business. The guy that crossed the desert between Santa Fe and Ruby more times than any man alive. He had rode for the Pony Express, and if he didn't get shot at by at least 3 Apaches on that run every day, he would just fall asleep in the saddle. That's the kind of man he was. Yes, sir, old Captain Jack Reacher was one of the last of the breed. He could outshoot, out-wrestle, outsmart any engine in the territory and wasn't afraid of nobody. He came into the store on their last day, just hot off the trail, dusty and dirty, looking to get resupplied and looking for his next bunch of greenhorns to take to Ruby. Well, the Galliano brother couldn't believe their luck. He was the roughest, toughest, rootinest, tootinest, most knowledgeable man in the West about keeping greenhorns alive this side of the Mississippi. Yes, sir, old Captain Jack Reacher himself, and he was standing right there in their store asking if they knew anybody that wanted to go to Ruby, pick up gold nuggets as big as your thumb, and get rich, rich, rich. Well, the Galliano brothers were speechless. They were like deers caught in the lantern light. And then old Anthony Galliano, he was a talkative one of the bunch, said, you don't need to look no further because we want to go to Ruby and pick up gold nuggets as big as your thumb and get rich, rich, rich. But they tell them they want to get there as fast as possible. So they're willing to just take horses and some back mules and ride as hard as fast as they can to get to Ruby, while they could still be able to pick up gold nuggets as big as your thumb and get rich, rich, rich. So they load up their supplies, head out on the next morning, and after 6 long dusty days on the trail, the last 2 without water, they reach the San Pedro. So as they're sitting there around the campfire that night, splashing in the river and drinking it up, old Captain Jack tells them boys he's mighty proud of them. They did a good job on the trail, didn't even run into no Apaches, and old Philip shot that rattler right between the eyes and was making a fine, fine dinner. Now all they had to do was go 1 day south, 1 day west, and then 1 day north to pick up the trail again about 3 miles west of here on the other side of the river. Then it's only a short jaunt to Ruby. Well, the boys were just dumbfounded. Did they just hear right? Here they were paying old Captain Jack top dollar to get them to the gold fields of Ruby so they could pick up gold nuggets as big as your thumb and get rich, rich, rich. And old Captain Jack was going to take 1 day south, 1 day west, 1 day north, just to get to a spot only 3 miles across the river. What the heck was going on around here? Well, Captain Jack tells them they can't cross here because the whole area on the other side of the river is an ancient Indian burial ground. Bad, bad medicine. Guarded by spirits of the dead, and some say even a chupacabra. The most nastiest, deadliest, half man, half beast thing out there with big old claws and big old fangs that would rip you to pieces just as soon as look at you. And he heard rumors of unbelievable things happening to anybody who tried to take a shortcut and are never heard from again. And the chupacabra has a pile of their bones in the 4 corners of the burial grounds as a warning for everyone to stay out. So the Galliano brothers can't believe old Captain Jack, the roughest, toughest, rootinest, toothless hombre this side of the Mississippi, is afraid of ghosts. Are you kidding me? But he says, no way, Jose, he's not crossing here. So the Galliano brothers break out their jug of whiskey and start parley-booing, and soon they offer him double his pay to take the shortcut. Now, old Captain Jack was getting up there in age. He got arrow wounds and bullet wounds, been kicked by mules and half drowned in rivers more than a couple times. And he's been thinking about settling down on that pretty piece of land he has down by Douglas. And if you can get old John Slaughter's daughter, Juanita, who he's been courting to marry him, things would just be right as rain. So he tells those Galliano brothers that if they pay him triple, he'll take them across. And he tells them since it'll be a full moon tonight, they'll just wait until dark and sneak across. Well, the Galliano brothers couldn't say yes fast enough. So dark comes and they tie his rags around the horses' noses and feet to keep them quiet, and they start swimming the river. They were going slow and being quiet, and about 200 feet up on the other side from the back, old Philip, the youngest of the bunch, lets out the most blood-curdling scream you ever did hear. Not a minute later, they could hear old Anthony screaming. Then they saw this big wolf-like creature that could run standing up, snarling and flashing his teeth. And with a full moon, they could see blood and drool dripping from his long snout. Well, the 2 other boys, Horses stooped and veered off to the left. They ran right off a 50-foot cliff. Both died instantly. Some say it was a blessing. Now it was only Captain Jack and the beast. That beast focused on Captain Jack and took off for all he was worth. Captain Jack put the spurs to his horse and was flying like the wind, but he wasn't fast enough. That chupacabra jumped up and landed on the rump of Jack's horse, started slashing at his horse with his back claws, slashing at Jack with his front claws, and trying to bite Captain Jack's hand off. Right then, old Captain Jack made a run right for a big old mesquite tree, and he's trying to fend off that beast as best as he could that it's latched upon his hand that was holding his pearl-handled 44 that he won in a poker game from Buffalo Bill Cody himself. And he tries to line up a shot on that old chupacabra. Right about then, old Captain Jack sees a low branch coming up and ducks down in the nick of time, but then heard a big rip, and then his left arm almost gets jerked from his socket. Captain Jack put the spurs to that horse and rode him nonstop all the way to Tombstone. And the horse dropped dead right in front of the first saloon at the edge of town. He pulled himself out from under that horse, crawls into the saloon, gets himself up on a chair in the corner and just sits there. Now the first thing everyone notices, because they all know Captain Jack, is his hair turned completely white. The second thing they notice is his bloody stump where his hand used to be. And they say if you go to that pile of bones in the corner of the burial ground on the night of a full moon, you could still see a hand holding a pearl-handled 44. Dead.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Get some snacks. Please do not bring food or drink back in here. Consume it in the lobby, hit the restroom if you need to, and let's be back here in a little over 5 minutes. We're running late, so let's be back here pretty quick. The sound of the cowbell, and buy your tickets. Or at least involved with
Is everybody back? Okay, we're gonna speaker section speak.
folks, sit down, please.
Okay. Okay, tonight our speaker is Jan Cleere, and she is a writer, historian, and lecturer. She has 6 historical nonfiction books out, the latest of which is Military Wives in Arizona Territory, the history of women who shaped the frontier. Tonight, though, she's going to talk about legacies of the past, Arizona women who made history. Jan, it's all you there.
All right, thank you, Liz. Is that gonna be okay for me?
Yeah. It'll be
All right. So I'm one of the short ones too, but this is a good sound system in here. This really is nice. Yeah. I appreciate you all inviting me to come and talk tonight. What I've done is put together just a handful of stories about the early women of Arizona who settled, civilized, and defended the land.
Now, some of these women gained a degree of celebrity across the state, within their communities, and throughout their tribal regions, while others remained relatively unknown. The women I'll talk about tonight represent many more who had an impact on Arizona's past. And I thought you'd enjoy seeing some of the old photographs I found while I was doing my research. They always add so much to a story. Now, land drove the pioneers west. The promise of fertile soil to grow crops, raise families, build homes, and start towns. The lure of gold and silver certainly brought many into Arizona territory, but it was the abundance of land that kept them here. Land meant prosperity, community, and continuity to uprooted pioneers. This lust for land also brought devastation to native peoples as pioneers encroached on their terrain, claiming it as their own. Indigenous tribes watched Anglo interlopers trample the unspoiled landscape, making little effort to understand native customs and beliefs. Disaster was imminent. This is the Apache warrior Lozin. Lozin was born sometime between the mid-1830s and mid-1840s. She was a Chinene Apache, and she probably grew up in what is now southwestern New Mexico, in an area known as Warm Springs or Ojo Caliente. Now, even as a child, Lozin's athletic abilities surpassed those of her peers. She could outride, outshoot, outrun, and outrow even the most agile boys. And by the time she was in her 20s, she was an expert at stealing horses. Lozin also acquired an adept knowledge of herbs and plants, and she was often called on to minister to the injured and the sick. This ability to heal, along with the uncanny knowledge to detect enemies from great distances, were powers that were supposedly given to Lozin by Usen, the Apache creator of life. Now, she would stand as she is in this picture here with her arms outstretched, palms up, and she would turn to follow the sun. When she felt a tingling in her hands and her palms darkened, she knew from which direction the enemy would come. Because of her skills and mystical talents, Lozin sat beside her brother, Chief Victorio, at council meetings and participated in warrior ceremonies. So very few Apache women reached the status that Lozin experienced. Now, hostilities between incoming Europeans and the Apaches went beyond any chance of a peaceful settlement by the early 1860s. Chief Victorio had signed several peace treaties with the United States, but the military had not honored any of them. So in retaliation for the stealing of their land, Chief Victorio and Lozin, along with Nana, a respected Apache warrior, ransacked encroaching settlements. But by 1870, the military had forced the Chinene from their land, moving them from one reservation to another. In 1876, they were herded onto the San Carlos Indian Reservation, a desolate, unhealthy expanse in southeast Arizona known as Hell's 40 Acres. Well, the Chinene bristled under the strict reservation rules imposed on them. And in 1877, 300 Chinene, led by Chief Victorio and Lozin, escaped from San Carlos and returned to their homeland in Warm Springs. Now, it is Apache by the name of James Kaiwakla that gives us one of the only firsthand accounts we have of Lozin. James was just a young boy when he saw her as she was riding into a river while guiding the Chinene as they fled from San Carlos. There was a commotion, and the long line parted to let a rider through, James later wrote. I saw a magnificent woman on a beautiful black horse, Lozin, sister of Victorio, Lozin, the woman warrior. High above her head, she held her rifle. There was a glitter as her right foot lifted and struck the shoulder of her horse. He reared, then plunged into the torrent. She turned his head upstream, and he began swimming. 2 years later, the Chinene were once again ousted from Warm Springs, and this time sent to New Mexico's Mescalero Reservation. Rumors circulated that Victorio was targeted for arrest, so he and his band, including Lozin, fled into the mountains. At this time in our history, soldiers had orders to shoot on sight any Apache, man, woman, or child who was not on a reservation. Military battles, took a devastating toll. During one skirmish with ammunition running low, Lozen agreed to make the long trip back to the Mescalero Reservation and return with the additional ammunition as well as more warriors. Now, she always felt it was her duty to protect the women and children of the tribe, so she agreed to take with her a young pregnant woman who wanted to return to the reservation. Shortly after the two women set out, Lozen hid the pregnant woman in a wash and stood guard as soldiers passed by, and the woman silently gave birth. As soon as mother and child could travel, they headed out. They were always short of food and water. As they approached the Rio Grande, Lozen watched as a herd of cattle entered the riverbed. Then, using only her knife, she killed one of the cows, a feat even a strong man would hesitate to undertake. But water became a bigger issue because they had no container to hold a sufficient supply. And they also traveled without horses, so they would not be easily detected. That was until Lozen spotted a troop of Mexican soldiers across the Rio Grande. She hid mother and baby, and after dark, she swam across the river and crept into the soldiers' campsite. With the leather rope she had fashioned from the dead cow's hide, she slipped a lasso around the neck of one of the horses, leaped on, and fled just as the soldiers spotted her. But there were many days with very little water. Lozen killed a cat and used its stomach for a makeshift canteen, but it only held a small supply. Then, when they came upon a lone soldier, Lozen quickly divested him of his rifle, his ammunition, a blanket, and his life. But most treasured was his canteen. Finally arriving at the Mescalero Reservation, Lozen learned that on October 14, 1880, her brother Victorio and 78 of his followers had been killed in Mexico at the Battle of Tres Castillos. 68 were taken prisoner, with only 17 escaping, including the elderly Nana. So Lozen joined 80-year-old Nana and the few remaining Apaches to avenge Victorio's death. More than 1,000 soldiers and civilians pursued this handful of renegades. Well, the Chinende eventually rode into Mexico, and there they joined forces with the Chiricahua Apache warrior Geronimo, who had also escaped from the San Carlos Reservation. The combined forces ravaged the countryside. We were reckless with our lives, Geronimo said, because we felt every man's hand was against us. Now, within Geronimo's camp, Lozen met a young Chiricahua woman named Detoste. Detoste spoke English, so Geronimo used the two women to take messages back and forth to military personnel as he bartered for the surrender of his people. In September 1886, with over 5,000 military troops hunting him down, Geronimo surrendered. Lozen and Detoste were with him, along with just a handful of men, women, and children. Now, the Apaches boarded a train that was to take them to an encampment at Fort Marion, Florida. In this photo, they're actually at a rest stop and they've been let out of the train. And this is the only known photograph of Lozen. I put a red arrow where she's sitting in the back row. I know it's difficult to see. To your immediate right of Lozen, supposedly, is Detoste. And of course, Geronimo is in the front row. He's the third man in on the right, sitting down. Well, the Apaches spent about a year in Florida before they were relocated to Mount Vernon Barracks, which is just north of Mobile, Alabama. The Apaches weren't used to this very humid, swampy southern land, and many of them died from illnesses such as diphtheria and tuberculosis. Lozen lasted less than 3 years. On June 17, 1889, she died from tuberculosis and is buried in an unmarked grave. Now, Detoste survived bouts of tuberculosis and pneumonia while she was imprisoned in Alabama. She was eventually sent to the reservation at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where she lived for the next 19 years before being allowed to return to the Mescalero Apache Reservation. And of course, Geronimo died at Fort Sill in 1909. In 1913, the surviving Apaches were set free. That's one side of our history. On the other side, we have the story of Larsena Pennington Page. It was 1857 when farmer Elias Pennington and his 12 motherless children joined a wagon train that was headed from Texas to California looking for more productive land. I'm sorry, are we having a problem?
No, don't worry.
Okay. Right. I don't know, he keeps creeping up on me, I'm not too sure. Yeah. Elias Pennington's wife, Julia Ann, had died 2 years before they started this trek from Texas to California. 20-year-old Larsena Pennington had been born in Tennessee, and she was the third oldest of the Pennington children. Larsena became ill as the family neared Fort Buchanan and, of course, what was then still New Mexico territory, because it would be 1863 before it was Arizona territory. Well, rather than risk his daughter's health, Elias settled his family near Sonoyta Creek until they could resume their journey. And from there, the family moved into a stone house. I'm sorry.
I've got you off.
Okay.
That's the stone house?
That's the stone house.
Yeah, see, I got there before you did.
All right. The stone house is at right by the Santa Cruz River. Well, it wasn't long before a young lumberman, John Hempston Page, came calling on the attractive Larsena. And on Christmas Eve, 1859, the couple were married in Tucson. Now, John Page was employed by a man named William Kirkland to cut down trees and haul lumber. Shortly after the couple were married, John headed into the Santa Rita Mountains to chop trees. Larsena went with him. For companionship, while the men were away all day, she agreed to take with her 10-year-old Mercedes Sayas Queros, who was a ward of William Kirkland's. Kirkland had asked Larsena to teach Mercedes the English language. On the morning of March 16, 1860, there were still some patches of snow clinging to the ridges of the mountains near the Madeira Canyon campsite. Well, the men left for the pinery, and Larsena sent Mercedes outside to play while she cleaned up inside their tent, which is what they were living in there. Mercedes' scream sent Larsena bolting out of the tent, where she was confronted by 5 Tonto Apache warriors. With their lances pointed at the 2 women, the Apaches ransacked the campsite, then motioned Larsena and Mercedes to move forward. Now, Mercedes understood some of the Apache Spanish dialect, and she recognized enough words to determine they were boasting to the women they had killed John Page and his partners. The Apaches forced marched their 2 prisoners deep into the mountains. Around sunset, and they were about 15 miles from the Page campsite, Larsena could go no farther. So one of the men heaved her over his shoulder, and the group set off at an even faster pace. Well, the man didn't last long before he threw Larsena to the ground. She was ordered to remove her heavy jacket, her skirt, and her shoes, which she did, and then she turned to continue the journey. In an instant, one of the men grabbed his lance and jabbed it between Larsena's shoulders. The others joined the fray, repeatedly piercing her body. As she tumbled down the steep ravine, the men hurled rocks at her head and left her for dead behind a tree and set off with little Mercedes. For 3 days, Larsena lay where she landed, wavering in and out of consciousness. Now, the patches of snow that were still clinging to the mountain, plus the frozen earth beneath her, staved the flow of blood from the stab wounds and probably saved her life. During her days of delirium, Larsena thought she heard her husband's voice. But of course, the Apaches said they had killed John Page, so she assumed she was just disoriented. But she heard him again, and she slowly realized John really was calling her, that he was alive, and he was looking for her. She tried to cry out, but her voice was barely audible. John passed by without knowing Larsena lay in the ravine just below his footsteps. It was about 2 hours after Larsena and Mercedes were taken captive that John returned to the deserted campsite. And he quickly assembled a posse and headed into the mountains to rescue the women. Twice he passed the ravine where Larcena lay, but he couldn't hear her feeble cries, and he continued to follow her footsteps, her shoes now worn by one of the Apaches. Well, as she lay on the mountain, Larcena ate snow to quench her thirst, and she knew she'd have to get off the mountain under her own power with whatever strength she had left. She struggled to her feet and started down the mountain. But by the end of the first day, her bare feet were so swollen and pitted with small rocks that she knew if she were going to survive, she would have to crawl down the mountain. Weak and half naked, Larcena started her descent on her hands and knees. Now, of course, most days she could crawl down the mountain, but there were also days she had to go up the mountain before she could find a pathway that would take her to safety below. Her stab wounds bled profusely, weakening her even more. Now, she existed mainly on wild onion seeds and grass until the day she spotted a rabbit. Heaving a stone at the unsuspecting hare, she killed it instantly. Only taking time to skin the poor creature, she later said, "No food ever tasted so good as that raw rabbit." 12 days into her ordeal, Larcena saw a wagon traveling along a road that was still quite a distance from her. She removed the remains of her tattered and blood-spattered petticoat, shouted and waved at the drivers, but the men couldn't hear her. 2 more days passed before she reached the base of the mountain. Stumbling along the road with little clothing left on her emaciated body, she was spotted by a man who thought an apparition was careening toward him. Larcena, bloodied and bruised, her mud-clotted hair twisting and spiraling around her sunken face, clad only in a thin chemise that failed to cover her raw flesh, panicked the poor man. But he finally came to his senses, gathered her up, and carried her to a nearby lumber camp. It had been exactly 2 weeks since she had been captured. She was not expected to live. Larcena, however, had no intention of dying now that she was off that mountain. And although she bore the physical scars of her ordeal for years, she did recover. It was about 2 days after Larcena was found that Mercedes Theisqueros was traded for a handful of Apache prisoners and returned home. The following year, in March of 1861, John Page was killed by a band of Apaches. That September, Larcena gave birth to her first child, Mary Ann Page. Now, Larcena did remarry. In 1870, she married William Fisher Scott, and Scott owned a flour mill in Tucson, and she had 2 more children. Larcena died March 13, 1913, at the age of 76. Now, I'm sure almost all of you are aware there is a street in downtown Tucson called Pennington Street. It's not named for Larcena. It's named for her father, Elias Pennington, who brought his children into Arizona, intending to stay only a short while before moving on. Many of the Penningtons never left. Now, African-American women have been a presence on the Western frontier for over 300 years, sometimes barely visible and rarely with a voice of their own. Initially, many of these women came as chattel of white slaveholders. Of course, during and after the Civil War, African Americans fled the South, seeking opportunities in the loosely woven fabric of Western communities. So it wasn't long before laws banishing African American children from the schoolroom started appearing on Arizona's legislative books. A 1909 law allowed segregation of Black students, and in 1912, segregation was ordered in all grade schools. By 1921, Arizona was one of the strictest Western states to ban Blacks from white classrooms. This was the atmosphere that Rebecca Huey Dallas encountered when she came to Arizona to teach in 1929. Now, Rebecca had been born in Connorsville, Indiana. And she went on to graduate from Swift Memorial College in Rogersville, Tennessee in 1924. I found Swift College quite interesting. It had been founded back in 1883 by the Reverend William Henderson Franklin, who himself was the son of slave parents. Swift College opened the world of education to many Southern African-American students. Well, in 1923, Rebecca married William Curtis Dallas, and then, as I said, she received her teaching certificate the following year. The couple moved to Phoenix in 1929. Now, in Phoenix, William opened the Dallas Funeral Home, which he operated until 1932. Rebecca taught school in Mobile, Arizona, which was a predominantly Black community about 30 miles southwest of Phoenix. And at that time, 2 old railroad cars served as the segregated schoolhouses in Mobile. Rebecca went on to earn her master's degree in education from the University of Arizona in 1935. 4 years later, she and William moved to Casa Grande. Now, back in 1933, the Black population of Casa Grande had increased to the point that a separate, quote, colored school was required by the laws of the state. In 1939, Rebecca replaced the retiring teacher at the one-room South Side Colored Grammar School, which was located in a far corner on the grounds of the White South School. The cramped building accommodated between 50 and 70 students. As one student remembered, entering the long, narrow school building made her feel like cattle going through a chute. You had to listen to all the noise from everyone, said another student. There were no divisions or separations in that building, but we did the best we could because that's all we had. Earning about 1/3 less than her white counterparts, Rebecca was allotted tattered textbooks with missing pages and worn down chalk from the nearby white school. Her students were not allowed to ride school buses with white children and banned from the playground when white children were at recess. But Rebecca was determined to produce strong, educated students. Now, she worked without benefit of anything like a library or science equipment, but still her courses of study consisted of extracurricular subjects as well as academic classes. With no school facilities for programs such as home economics, she taught students how to cook in her own kitchen. She had older children tutor youngsters outside under a tree to reduce the noise in the cramped classroom. And then when she discovered some of her students needed an understanding of Spanish to enroll in college, she ordered a correspondence course and learned the language right along with them. Integration became a volatile subject in Casa Grande during the late 1940s when a white farm woman, Louise Hennis, argued before the Board of Education to approve equal schooling for all the town's children. Public opinion, however, vetoed any vote for integration. 2 years later, Hennis again opened the discussion of integration in the schools, and this time the Casa Grande School Board approved the issue. In 1952, Rebecca left the narrow classroom of Southside for Casa Grande's new East School. She acquired the title of head teacher. But it wasn't until 1960 that the school board was comfortable naming her principal, the job she had performed over the last 8 years. Rebecca retired from East School in 1962, and she died in 1971. Among her possessions was a scrapbook of newspaper articles detailing the momentous 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision of the United States Supreme Court abolishing segregation. And in 1992, the old Southside Colored Grammar School was relocated onto the grounds of the Casa Grande Valley Historical Society Museum and renamed the Rebecca Dallas Schoolhouse in honor of the woman who influenced the education of so many Black students. In 2017, Rebecca was inducted into the Arizona Women's Hall of Fame. Now, according to our next woman, Maria Mercatus, was born on a cold winter night by the light of an oil lamp. A curandero was in attendance, and my aunt was accompanying my mother at my birth. She said I was born with a strange veil over my face. The curandera said this meant I would be able to tell the future. Well, Maria was born in Tucson on the evening of December 9th, 1908. And if she could tell the future, she would have foreseen her life unfolding significantly different from that of her parents. Her father never attended school, and her mother did not go beyond the 3rd grade. But their youngest child thrived in school, even though education of Mexican children at the time was far from perfect. Maria and other Mexican students were often punished in school for speaking their native language. And students were not allowed to advance from the 1st grade until they had mastered the English language. So many of these children spent 2 and 3 years in the 1st grade. And of course, it was difficult for children to adapt to this new language because, of course, Spanish was still spoken in their homes, and instruction in English was very sparse. They were expected to pick it up on their own. Maria was an avid student, and she went on to attend Arizona State Teachers College, which of course is now ASU. And she actually graduated as valedictorian in 1928. She began her teaching career at Tucson's segregated Davis Elementary School. Now, of course, Maria's Hispanic background made her the ideal teacher for Tucson's bilingual schools. And through the years, Maria fought to allow her students to speak and learn their native language. This was against all the rules in Arizona schools at the time. Having to speak English in her classes, Maria once said, "If I ever go to hell, it will be for scolding students for speaking Spanish." In 1948, Maria was transferred to Tucson's predominantly Anglo Sam Hughes Elementary School. The differences that existed between the Davis and Hughes School struck her as absurd. Why should Davis students play on a barren, dirt-strewn playground, while Hughes children enjoyed lush green grass and playground equipment? Why did Davis not have a library when there was a perfectly good one at Hughes? Maria argued that students could learn from one another, regardless of their culture or their background. And she began a crusade to introduce bilingual, bicultural teaching programs in schools all across the country. Now, her perseverance and advocacy for introducing bilingual education led 5 United States presidents to appoint Maria to national education organizations. And in 1966, she was part of a symposium that introduced the bilingual education concept to Congress. And in 1968, Congress passed the Bilingual Education Act, providing school districts with federal funds to establish educational programs for children with limited English-speaking abilities. Now, in 1963, Maria became the first woman to chair the Arizona State Board of Public Welfare. She participated in and led many organizations that benefited children, including serving with the Pima County Association for Juveniles, where she was instrumental in obtaining a separate area to hold detained children in the county jail instead of them having them incarcerated with adult inmates. Through the years, Maria received numerous awards for her service to students. A scholarship was established in her name at the U of A, where she also received an honorary Doctor of Law degree for her work in education. She received the Medallion of Marriage in 1984, and this was only the 5th time the award had been given in the U of A's history. Maria was inducted into both the Hispanic Hall of Fame as well as the Arizona Women's Hall of Fame. Now, Maria retired from teaching in 1978, but she always felt she had failed her students because bilingual education did not teach the Anglo child to speak Spanish. But if it had not been for her advocacy and persistence, many Hispanic children would have been left behind to struggle on their own, trying to communicate in predominantly Anglo communities. Now we're going to take a little step back in time. Back in the fall of 1864, Arizona's first territorial legislature met in Prescott. At that time, men did not believe women had the Constitution to stand up to the rigors of the legislative process. even though women had been making judgments for their families and their communities long before the white man decided they were too weak to do so. One of these early women was Annie Dodge Winnetka. Now, Annie was born on the Navajo reservation. Her mother, Kehanava, was a wife of Henry J. Dodge, one of the wealthiest and most respected Navajo ranchers and leaders. In 1918, Annie's father sent the 8-year-old to a government boarding school at Fort Defiance. She completed 5th grade there and then went on to Albuquerque Indian School. When I went to elementary school on the reservation, Annie said, the speaking of Navajo was forbidden. And when I went to the Albuquerque Indian School, the speaking of Navajo was still prohibited. So I and many of my Pueblo friends decided we were going to speak the very best English that we could. It was very unfortunate that I had to forsake my Navajo friends and not enjoy the privilege of speaking my native language. In 1929, Annie married George Winnetka, a young man she'd met at school. And over the years, the couple had 10 children. But Annie spent very little time at home. Back in 1923, Henry J. Dodge had become the first chairman of the newly organized Navajo Tribal Council. J. Dodge played an integral role in resolving disputes between Navajos and government agents. And he believed education was the key to bringing his people into the 20th century. Now, he relied on Annie to attend meetings with him and assist with interpreting. So it wasn't long before Annie became a dominant figure at tribal meetings, working with her father to improve living conditions on the reservation. J. Dodge actually wanted more boarding schools and advocated the teaching of English to Navajo children. He fought to stop the sale of liquor to the Navajos, knowing its effect on his people. 90-year-old Henry J. Dodge died in 1947, leaving Annie to continue in his stead. And in 1951, she was elected to the Navajo Tribal Council. She was only the second woman to hold a seat on the council. 2 years later, she was appointed chair of the Health and Welfare Division of the Community Services Committee that dealt with the issue of tuberculosis on the reservation. Well, Annie was keenly aware of the ravages of tuberculosis. So in order to fight the disease, she sought out experts to better understand the sickness. And she took classes at the University of Arizona, receiving a degree in public health. She visited Hogan's and witnessed firsthand the toll contagious diseases took on families. Now, she encouraged medicine men and doctors to work together to provide a better understanding of medical issues. Annie always tore across the reservation in a beat-up old pickup truck, delivering fruits and vegetables, only to have the produce sit unprotected on dirt floors. So she went to the council seeking money to build wooden floors in the Hogans. She insisted toilet facilities be built farther from houses and argued for funds to improve water quality. She taught women the benefits of canned meats and powdered milk while advocating better health care for pregnant women and infants. She went to the Departments of Education in both Arizona and New Mexico, asking that students be taught personal hygiene and disease prevention. She also chaired the Alcoholism Committee and continued the efforts of her father to ban the sale of liquor on the reservation. During the 1960s, the death rate among Navajo infants declined by 25%, and the ravages of tuberculosis were reduced by 35%. Annie is recognized as the leader in improving the well-being of the Navajo. In 1963, Annie became the first Native American to receive the highest honor given to a civilian. President Lyndon Johnson awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her crusade in the betterment of the health of her people. Now, Annie also became the voice of the Navajo in Washington, D.C. She spoke before Congress on many occasions. Now, she always dressed just like she is in this picture here. This is typical Navajo clothing, a long tiered skirt topped with a plush velvet blouse, and then of course one of those gorgeous orange blossom necklaces. When a congressman once told Annie to, quote, quit playing Indian, Annie calmly replied, Congressman, I didn't come here to talk about your clothes, so you ignore mine and let's talk legislation. Annie was inducted into the Arizona Women's Hall of Fame as well as the National Women's Hall of Fame. And the Navajo Council declared her the legendary mother of the Navajo people. And she is associated with individuals from all walks of life. Here she is with actor Robert Redford at a conference at Canyon de Chelly. At age 83, Annie developed Alzheimer's disease, and she died in 1997. Then Navajo President Albert Hale called her one of the great Navajo leaders. Now, the year before her death, the University of Arizona awarded Annie an honorary Doctor of Law degree. Of course, she was unable to attend the ceremony, so her grandson, Milton Bluehouse Jr., accepted the award for her. I didn't know she was famous until about my senior year in high school, Milton said. Before that, I figured she's just my grandmother. I thought, grandmothers do these things. They jump in their trucks and they go everywhere. Now we'll move up to a little more modern time. As a somewhat middle-aged, stout woman headed into the Arizona State Supreme Court building, she was stopped by a guard who informed her she had to move her car because where she had parked was reserved for Arizona Supreme Court judges only. It took some doing, laughed Lorna Lockwood, but I finally persuaded him I was entitled to this spot, even if I was a woman. In 1961, at the age of 58, Lorna Lockwood climbed the steps of the courthouse as the first woman to sit on the bench of the Arizona State Supreme Court. Now, this was only one of the first that Lorna accomplished during her lifetime. She was a native Arizonan. She was born in Douglas, and her family moved here to Tombstone in 1913 when her father, Alfred Lockwood, was appointed Superior Court Judge for Cochise County. And Lorna went on to graduate from Tombstone High School in 1920, but only after obeying her father and spending a year at home learning the domestic arts. Once she had conquered household duties, the judge wholeheartedly supported her efforts to break through glass ceilings not yet attained by women. Lorna went on to graduate from the University of Arizona in 1923, and she immediately set her sights on a law degree, becoming only the second woman admitted to the U of A School of Law, and she graduated in 1925. Unfortunately, Lorna discovered no one would hire a woman lawyer, and the only jobs available were as a legal secretary or a law clerk. Now, her father was now sitting on the bench of the Arizona State Supreme Court, so Lorna went to work as his secretary until 1939, when she and another female attorney opened an all-woman law firm. The people were still hesitant to hire women lawyers, and the partnership dissolved after a few short years. Lorna, however, persisted. She ran for and won a seat in the Arizona House of Representatives as a Democratic representative from Maricopa County. She was active on the Child Welfare Committee as well as in public health and education, and her legal background provided her the opportunity to serve as vice chair of the House Judiciary Committee. And when she was reelected in 1941, she presided over the Judiciary Committee. At the beginning of World War II, Lorna resigned her position and headed to Washington, D.C. to work as secretary for Arizona's lone member of the U.S. House of Representatives, John R. Murdoch. After the war, she joined her father in private practice. In 1947, Lorna won her third term in the Arizona House of Representatives. 2 years later, she resigned her position to accept the position of Assistant Attorney General. In 1950, Lorna decided to seek a seat at the State Superior Court representing Maricopa County. Now, Lorna was one of 13 lawyers running for 5 seats on the court. So she told her audiences to vote for the first candidate of their choice and for their second, third, and fourth selections. All I ask is that you cast your 5th vote for me, she said, and give a woman a chance to prove herself on the bench in Arizona. And on election day, Lorna garnered enough votes to land the 5th position on the bench, becoming the first woman elected to Arizona's Superior Court. Now, Lorna quickly earned the reputation as a tough but fair judge. And she broke no nonsense in her courtroom from attorneys who thought a woman judge would be easy prey. Antics from over-exuberant litigators frequently resulted in a fine and a stern warning. In 1954, she presided over the juvenile division of the court, and she made needed improvements in the treatment of children in the legal system. And her work with children extended beyond the courtroom. She was instrumental in founding the state's Big Sisters and Big Brothers organizations, as well as the Girls Ranch of Arizona. In 1960, Lorna Lockwood was elected as the first woman to serve on the Arizona State Supreme Court. In 1965 and again in 1970, she was selected as Arizona's Chief Justice, the first woman in the country to attain the highest state judicial position. Twice, Arizona Senator Carl Hayden put Lorna's name before President Lyndon Johnson as a possible candidate for the United States Supreme Court. President Johnson, however, was not convinced the country was ready to accept a woman to the highest court in the land. Now, Lorna was an advocate for women's rights, although she did not consider herself a militant feminist. But I am terribly glad when women succeed, she said. Lorna retired from the bench in 1975, and she died in 1977. Now, after her death, a group of women lawyers instituted the Lorna Lockwood Traveling Trophy. As you can see, this trophy consists of a slim blonde Barbie doll dressed in a black robe with a plaque attached, listing the names of Arizona women who had ascended to the judiciary. And it was agreed that when the first woman was appointed to the United States Supreme Court, the trophy would be retired. So in 1981, when Sandra Day O'Connor took the bench on the United States Supreme Court, she acquired ownership of the Lorna Lockwood Traveling Trophy. According to Justice O'Connor, each position I held in Arizona was one which was attained by following a course made far more accessible because Lorna Lockwood had prepared the way by proving it could be done and done well by a woman. This handful of women, and many more like them, are the foundation of our heritage and our culture. We need to recognize and acknowledge the contributions of these women, plus hundreds more. Only through their valor and determination did the West develop and prosper. So here's to the ladies. May they forever be the caretakers of our past and our future. Thank you all very, very much. Questions, or if you have any comments, I'd be delighted to hear them. Nothing at all? Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Can't let you go quite yet. Okay, we have something for you.
Oh,
Hey,
thank you, sir.
Cochise County Corral mug.